Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I think we should make a start. Welcome everybody to today's talk. It's called Thomas and Mary Moore, Rewriting Lives with Objects. And our speaker today is Kirstie Ross. These talks are organised by the Professional Historians of Australia, Victoria and Tasmania branch, and hosted by Libraries Tasmania. Today's talk is being broadcast as a webinar, and we're pleased to also welcome those people who are joining us online today. We're going to continue to record these talks and make them available on Libraries Tasmania's SoundCloud, which you can access by clicking on the cloud icon at the bottom of the Libraries Tasmania homepage. And if you've missed any of the other talks, you can also listen to them on SoundCloud. Now, if you haven't already done so, please switch your phones off now. And before I introduce Kirstie, I'd like to read to you Library Tasmania's acknowledgement of Tasmania's Aboriginal peoples. Libraries Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Lutruwita, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respects to the elders, past and present, who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. And we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. Now, Kirstie is a curator and a historian who's worked in museums and libraries for over 20 years in both New Zealand and Tasmania. Kirstie is currently Senior Curator Cultural Heritage at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, where she curated the 2019-2020 exhibition West, Out on the Edge, and her talk is based on content that featured in this exhibition. Now, please hold your questions to the end of the talk when Kirstie will take questions. And please join me and welcome you, Kirstie.
Just check the sound and that I'm reaching like that. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Clifford. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. It's so great to see many familiar faces and others who have kind of thought, oh, let's give this talk a go. And thank you, Liz, for the welcome and acknowledgement, the acknowledgement to country. I've been privileged to live here on the country of First Peoples of Lutruwita, working on the land of the Mumarimina and the Muwanina people, for the last 5 years, it's been a privilege to be able to do that, to be here. Just a couple of caveats before I get into my talk. Napkin, serviette. I'm going to use napkin because it's fewer syllables. Once I get into the talk, you'll understand why. And I'm going to be using a few terms kind of interchangeably and a bit kind of, I guess, a bit sloppily today. But I hope you'll forgive me. So those terms are gentility, respectability, and middle class. I am writing this up as a journal article, and in that article, I'll definitely be putting some footnotes and definitions alongside those terms. But for today, I think we'll all manage with me using them in a fairly fluid fashion. And just before I start too, who here uses napkin rings? Yeah? Who doesn't? Who's never used a napkin ring? Yeah? Okay. It's just interesting. I have 3, 1 given to me for my christening and 2 lovely Blackwood souvenir Tasmanian napkin rings that I purchased recently that I'll take home to New Zealand with me. Because I'll be actually leaving Tasmania next Thursday. So again, it's wonderful to have you here for my last talk here in the state. So 38-year-old Thomas Moore and 31-year-old Jane Mary Solly were married here at All Saints Anglican Church in South Hobart on the 9th of January 1889. The next day, the newlyweds set off for the West Coast to establish a residence at the Macquarie Harbour settlement of Strahan, where Tom was the Inspector of Public Works. The bride and groom were going to their new home overland on horseback instead of taking the coastal steamer. Now, this was an arduous and unconventional way to travel to the district, especially for a woman. As readers of the Mercury newspaper were reminded, the Moores were taking a route hitherto untravelled by any of the gentler sex. Late in the evening of the fifth night of the journey, Tom and Mary unlocked the door to their new cottage constructed just to the west of Strahan. Inside, the pair found a comfortable scene. Kind, willing hands had been at work, wrote Mary to her family, and every room was partially furnished and even oil lamps lit and wood ready for the fire. A few days after the couple's arrival, Strahan residents offered Mary a hearty welcome to the township. They hoped that she would be pleased with their beautiful bay and would enjoy many years of wedded happiness in her new home. But Tom's aversion to settled life meant that these good wishes came to nothing. By the time the Moores marked their third wedding anniversary, Tom had resigned from his stable government job to resume the track cutting and prospecting of his bachelor days. This took him away from the couple's home and family for months at a time. By 1913, after tolerating these extended separations for many years, Mary had shifted permanently to Hobart without her husband. Just getting used to this. But yes, excellent. It's not a talk unless you have a technical moment. Okay. So today, Tom is celebrated as a dogged explorer and prospector whose work contributed to the expansion of Western Tasmania. But his biographers do not shy away from his antisocial disposition and its impact on his relationships. The author of Tom's entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography candidly notes that his acceptance of the solitary life of a bushman instead of a respectable one as a married man led to estrangement from his family. And Patsy Crawford surmises in The Track Cutter that Tom was already wedded to the bush life when he met Mary and may have had little time to develop a romantic relationship according to common codes of courtship. Now, I think that this reduction of Mary to not much more than a victim of Tom's personal shortcomings stems from biographers' over-reliance on his field notebooks for their research. And although rich and detailed, this source gives a very partial view of Tom's world, recording his activities in the field, but not really his home life or domestic matters. Mary is mentioned in passing, but Tom is too immersed in his work to write about their relationship, nor would we expect him to in this context. And Mary, of course, is not the central subject of the biographies, but her life and role in Tom's warrants closer attention, if only to provide a better sense of the domestic situation he turned his back on. Now, biographers' failure to date to search out other texts robs the story of the couple's lives in Strahan of depth and texture. Besides reading more broadly, I think the real key to addressing this oversight may be diversifying the types of sources consulted. Objects, for example, are promising when common life writing texts for a subject are non-existent or minimal, a case that applies to Mary Moore. And objects can also prompt unexpected insights when documentary sources present a partial perspective or when contextualising ones are elusive. Now, material culture studies starts with this premise. And by taking objects seriously, making them central to historical endeavour, this approach has radical potential for historians. It's a method that's influenced how I have been thinking and writing about Tom and Mary Moore since I presented their story in that exhibition, West, in 2019. And in this talk, I will reveal how objects have obliquely and productively drawn out evidence of the couple's middle class respectability. These two napkin rings owned by the couple have been vital for my research. Although I will warn you now, they will not always be glaringly obvious in my narrative. This is not a history of how and when Tom and Mary used the napkins, which I think would be pretty boring and pretty banal and pretty impossible. My overall aim in using them and in using artifacts is to boost Mary's presence as an historical subject and provide details about the social milieu that Tom rejected. And more generally, my objective in adopting this method is to bring into sharper focus domesticity, gentility, and sociability on Tasmania's mining frontier in the late 19th century. By doing something really, really, please excuse me. Okay, so that's just a bit of the structure of the talk. Just to reassure you that I know where I'm going with it. And it's in two parts. The first part is quite general, a discussion of my approach. And then the second part really gets down to history business. So, okay. So the social history collections at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, which we all know as TMAG, are the starting point for my expanded biographical account of Tom and Mary Moore. This is because life stories are at the heart of a museum's social history collection. These assemblages of objects are the tangible evidence of lived experiences, dynamic interpersonal relationships, and social networks, which makes them ideal for applying the methods of material culture studies. I'm really being super hopeless here. Oh, I know why. I know why I'm being hopeless. Okay, right. The couple are materialised at TMAG in two donations. The first arrived 10 years ago when John Mitchell gifted the museum an aneroid barometer on screen. Tom Moore owned it before it came into the hands of the donor's father, Benjamin John Mitchell, a surveyor like Tom. Now, T.B. Moore and B.J. Mitchell are scratched onto the back. It's a bit hard to see them here. That's my photograph, but anyway, I can assure you that they're definitely there. And those names verify this kind of transfer of ownership and provenance. Now, common sense would suggest that the donor, John Mitchell, inherited the barometer from his father. But the reason for the barometer being passed from Tom Moore to Benjamin is unknown. But I'll be returning to this object in the second half of my talk, and I think we might be able to speculate or understand how the object moved between these two families. The barometer is not the only object related to the Moores at TMAG. In 2017, the museum received a gift from Tom and Mary's granddaughter, Barbara Alliston. There were 5 objects in the donation: a set of technical drawing instruments, a pocket barometer and a portable sundial, a magnifying glass, and here we have our hero objects, a pair of silver napkins, and they're engraved with the initials T and M. It's reasonable to assume that Tom used the first 4 items in the field or for related activities, and their significance is derived from their connection to his work. But domestic items like the napkin rings do not tally with the standard heroic narrative of Tom's rugged life in the bush. Now, the objects, the napkin rings, their incompatibility with existing biographies, I think, is the foundation of their usefulness as a source. Now, they relocate Tom from those male-only bush camps to the cottage he shared with Mary in Strahan. And this change of scene produces, I think, a more inclusive story, one that's not just about T, but also a little bit more about M. Now, at the time of their acquisition, museum staff did not record details about the napkin ring's history, use, or meaning. But thanks to basic records, we do at least know who owned them. But they're not chatty objects. They're not great sources of fact. They lack a maker's mark, so it's impossible to date them or assess their production within a history of decorative silverware or within the output of a particular maker. But their value as a source becomes clearer when we explore the social and cultural contexts within which Tom and Mary may have encountered or used these objects. And in the next part of my talk, I'm going to consider 3 of these contexts: gift giving, dining, and housework. So, gift giving. Napkin rings belong to a group of objects that in the 19th and 20th century played a part in polite dining. Generic sets were used for social dining, holding guests' napkins decoratively at individual place settings. Initialed or monogrammed napkin rings distinguished personal table linen within a household, when after use, napkins were rolled and pushed through the ring to be reused by the same person at the next meal. However, the first and I think most analytically rewarding context I want to consider is the genteel practice of giving presents to mark significant life milestones. Now, napkin rings have been popular gifts given at moments such as christenings, weddings, anniversaries, and farewells. And it's very feasible that these ones marked Tom and Mary's marriage in 1889. And with their fancy presentation, I think this suggests that they were purchased with this intention. Although, of course, I'm being speculative here, and you'll just have to bear with me through the rest of the talk, because we don't have documentation or a family anecdote that can confirm this. But I think the engraved initials are too much of a coincidence, the T and the M. It's too much of a coincidence for the pair to not be connected to Tom and Mary's legal pairing, their sentimental or their socio-economic pairing as husband and wife. And further research in TMAG's collections support this notion. The museum has another pair of monogrammed silver napkin rings, noted as having been a wedding present given to Ruth and Cecil Baldwin by Ruth's parents, Elizabeth and Henry Manning, in 1912. And press reports from the end of the 19th century also verify this, and I've just got one example up on the screen here. So wedding gifts were practical. They assisted a new couple to set up a new home of their own, but they had another function. They were socially charged keepsakes that indicated a shared class consciousness. They consolidated or promoted connections between the gift giver and recipients. Now, in this case, the case of Tom and Mary, the bride and groom were members of 2 well-established and influential Tasmanian families, especially Mary, whose father, Benjamin Travis Solly, was an eminent colonial administrator. Now, paying due respect to family affiliations through the choice of gift would have been foremost in the minds of guests invited to the more solemn wedding. So wedding presents were important for signalling shared understandings of consumption, economic capacity, and a familiarity with middle-class taste. And before I move on to the second context I mentioned, dining, I want to stress the importance of being aware of these interconnected practices of establishing, expanding, and strengthening middle-class family networks through marriage and the presentation of wedding gifts. This has been really, really pivotal for me, for rethinking the lives of Tom and Mary. And I'll be picking up this point later in my talk. So now I want to talk a little bit about genteel dining. Daniel Miller and Christopher Tilley observe that artefacts are implicated in the construction, maintenance, and transformation of social identities. And this can be said of objects like the napkin rings, that they materially express the prevailing norms that shaped Tom and Mary's conduct and social selves. I think of them as physical facts manufactured from the broader social and moral expectations, constraints, and everyday practices that influenced their domestic arrangements. And although physically minor, the napkin rings would have been a touchstone of respectability, a small reminder of the behaviours the Moors were expected to embody and model in all aspects of their lives. That they did so was especially critical given that their marital home was in Strahan, a raw and thinly populated town, perceived by some to be in urgent need of improvement. So this brings me to the second connected context in which the napkin rings accrued meaning, and that is as decorative dining accessories with connotations, again, of class and socio-economic identity. James Simons notes that from the 18th century, material expressions of status and social identity became commonplace at the table and an integral part of dining in all but the humblest homes. And archaeologist Sarah Hayes has observed of colonial Melbourne's established middle class that a well-set table was one of the most significant platforms for the display of gentility. Such displays were critical in colonial settings where the middle class was an inherently unstable position in society that required constant social, visual, and material reinforcement and policing. Press descriptions of public dining and photographs of these events, as well as of domestic interiors, show the material culture of dining that helped to define and shore up social affiliations and their attendant anxieties. And in this image, I've circled where the napkin ring is. It's a breakfast table, apparently, for one person, but still entirely appropriate to have a napkin ring. And I think also as you leave the talk today through the Allport Museum, just have a look at the dining room tableau, and that really kind of reinforces the kind of material culture and staging that respectability entails. But for those who needed guidance, books offering domestic advice prescribed the requisite objects. And a 1901 Hobart edition of Mrs. Beeton's cookery book, for example, informed Tasmanians that for dinner parties and everyday dining alike, the glass and silverware should be just right, the knives polished, the tablecloth and serviettes above reproach. Nicely folded serviettes, placed equidistant, a little way from the edge of the table, were recommended, but napkin rings were clearly the other option, given how often they appear in wedding gift lists and in classified advertising. So, now I want to just talk about women's domestic labour and housework. So, the dining room tableau that I've just touched on very briefly these displayed a genteel household's familiarity with respectable taste, middle-class consumption, and codes of conduct. And according to Linda Young, genteel knowledge was necessary to gather the correct goods for dining of the right combination in the precise order for just the purpose of dining. But she observes that the table, as a public-private interface, furnished the stage for the genteel performance of introduction, affiliation, connection, and validation. Another historian, Diane Lawrence, has explored gentility as performance too, with respect to British migrant women in the 19th century colonial settings. And as she puts it, the respectability of these women was expressed through modes of behaviour in conjunction with material means, that is, with stuff, with objects. The material culture of dress, living rooms, gardens, and food management, according to Lawrence, emerge as a critical mechanism for the ideological expression of colonialism. And it follows then that dining and its associated objects operated collectively as dynamic performances and material practices of gentility. But other unseen activities and less sumptuous and glittering material practices underpinned dining, without which it would fail to meet middle-class standards. For amongst other things, hostesses were judged on the cleanliness of their table linen. Dining was thus contingent on what took place behind the scenes in the laundry. And this expectation is captured in Mrs. Beeton's admonition that a household's linen ought to be above reproach. Tablecloths and napkins had to be spotlessly cleaned, starched, ironed, and folded before they were made to look pretty without being obtrusive on the table for guests. Attaining appropriate levels of cleanliness was until recently the heaviest of all domestic tasks, especially in a household without servants. Laundry required access to water and fuel, specific materials and equipment, and it took all day. Different textiles and garments required special washing and drying techniques and generated other labour-intensive activities. Yes, sorry, that I should have put that up a little bit earlier. Here's our nicely folded napkins. Anyway, so yes, laundry was done once a week. So a family's soiled table linen would not be washed after one use. Personalised napkins and napkin rings meant that family members could reuse their own linen hygienically and not someone else's napkins before washes. Now, this cheat that reduced the amount of linen to be laundered was acknowledged by Mrs. Beeton, who did allow that, if used a second time, napkins were to be simply run through a ring. Now, this reconfigures the napkin rings as small aids to reducing household labour without compromising the middle-class premium placed on personal, material, and environmental cleanliness. So I think that's enough kind of general information. So I'm just going to distill for you the three likely contexts in which Tom and Mary encountered today's hero objects, because these contexts are going to kind of coalesce in the second part of my talk. So firstly, as a wedding gift, the napkin rings were a tangible expression of status and middle-class networks. As table accessories, they signalled knowledge of genteel practices and performances. And as personal utensils, they were associated with the challenge of maintaining respectable levels of domestic cleanliness. Okay, I'm going to have a breather, have a drink, and then we'll get to some proper history. Right, so let's rejoin Tom and Mary at the start of their marriage on the track to their marital home, enjoying what the Mercury called a romantic bridal tour. I think the only really romantic thing was the scenery, which Mary actually compared to the paintings of Piganet. So travelling with few possessions was sensible while the pair honeymooned in the bush. Niceties such as engraved silver napkin rings would have been completely pointless in this setting, but it would have been improper for Tom and Mary to shun the material comforts of respectable married life once they settled down. And the couple's belongings, no doubt, including their wedding presents, napkin rings tucked away in a little part of a trunk, would have followed them to the west coast by steamer. I've not found a list of the Moors' possessions, but auction advertisements are a really useful window onto the types and volume of goods that the Moors might have owned. That might be a little bit hard to read, but if you want, I can tell you more about them at the end. Read out that list at the end of the talk. And these are the contents of Mrs. Ayrton's dining room, which I think are interestingly indicative, although it's a Hobart residence, so possibly or probably more furniture than the Moors might have had. So Strahan, where they were destined, had existed for less than a decade when Tom and Mary settled down there. And it was the discovery of minerals in the 1880s and consequent rushes that had attracted an influx of Europeans to the region, with the burgeoning port town servicing the booming economy and its peripatetic community. Now, the harbour did have a grim and cruel history prior to this, with a penal settlement for secondary offenders located on Sarah Island, with a group of Tasmanian Aboriginal people incarcerated there as well in 1832 and 1833 before being exiled to Waibelina on Flinders Island. Now, no doubt Strahan's more reputable residents at the end of the 19th century would have valued the Moors as a new married couple who would bring up a family in the town, who would act as civilizing agents in a region known as the Wild West. But as in other frontier settlements, it was Mary who would pick up the gendered task of refining the community's social and moral character. And the Mercury's local correspondent hinted at this, declaring that the advent of Mrs. T.B. Moore, the bride of the Inspector of Roads, was an agreeable addition to the town's lady residence. Now, a partial window onto Mary's performance of respectability via her day-to-day domestic and social rounds comes from an incomplete diary she kept in 1892. Tom and Mary were still living in the cottage they had occupied since their arrival in Strahan, with their first son born there in 1890, or at least born in 1890, and their first daughter born in 1891. The couple's second daughter arrived soon after Mary abandoned the diary. I can imagine why she did that with 3 young children. Tom came and went from Strahan at least 12 times in 1892 because of his prospecting in the Tyndall Range and because he'd left his government job at the end of 1891. His mobility is a counterpoint to Mary's geographically confined routine documented in her diary. Its meagre 27 matter-of-fact entries outline everyday concerns: cleaning, childcare, going to town, gardening, food preparation, washing and ironing, sewing and mending, correspondence, visiting and receiving visitors, attending church, and the weather. It's a pithy record of the practicalities of living in an isolated community. Mary's daily encounters reveal, however, the neighbourly sociability and support that defined middle-class life in a small frontier town, with mutual aid perhaps a response to the difficulties of securing domestic help in a remote region. And from the diary, we can, I guess, discern how genteel culture was adapted to the circumstances of living in a town with a population not intimately or historically connected. The women and men named by Mary in her diary infer the Moors' social position in Strahan. This circle consisted mostly of the town's professional families. The heads of these households were responsible for imposing order in the town and developing its infrastructure, and their wives, Strahan's lady residents, were expected to maintain and model middle-class domestic and community standards. These women would have participated in genteel rituals such as calling and taken care of homes furnished with objects similar to those owned by the Moors. However, the material means with which Mary and her fellow lady residents, if you can say that, the material means with which they performed this gentility, expected of their gender, social position, marital status, and race, is so integrated into everyday life that it is seldom referred to in her diary. Now, Mr. and Mrs. William Prior Hales, who arrived in Strahan at the end of 1889, were likely to have been the Moors' closest social peers. William Hales was a civil engineer supervising the construction of the railway between Strahan and Zeehan. William had married Marion Chilman in New Zealand, the country of her birth, where her father had been a member of the provincial government of Taranaki in the North Island. Now, William's father was the Archdeacon of Northern Tasmania. Through church business and diocese matters, he was well acquainted with Mary's father, who was active in Hobart's St. David's Anglican Church. And I would attribute Tom and Mary's selection of Mary and William as godparents to their third child as the result of their personal intimacy, shared faith, and the prior connections between the Hales and Solly families. And I think the Hales provided something approximating the kin support that Mary could have received had she and Tom lived in Hobart. Unfortunately, Mary's social interactions with Mary Hales in the period covered by her diary are few. A chance meeting while she was out with Tom on errands and 2 afternoon social calls. But the two families interacted frequently in practical ways. For example, Mary supplied the Hales with vegetables, milk and butter, and 14-year-old Annie Hales and 10-year-old May often helped Mary around the house or looked after the 2 more children at either family's home. And Marion Hales came to Mary's aid, as did others in the community when baby Margaret was sick and Tom was out of town. Now, on at least two occasions, 10-year-old May Hales also helped Mary with the ironing. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, a 10-year-old wielding an iron is kind of quite an interesting thought. But anyway, this would certainly have involved pressing table linen. And as you can see, with these diary entries here, Mary records doing the laundry and associated activities in 6 diary entries. Now, as these references to the tasks that were essential for the maintenance of a clean, tidy, and respectable household These are the ones that really lead us to the monogrammed napkin rings, which of course would have been used for dining between wash days to identify personal soiled linen. And it was these entries that enabled me to clearly see how napkin rings, at the heart of my research, had the potential to transform Mary's diary from a brusque chronicle of daily tasks into a highly concentrated account of gentility. Okay, right. So I'm just going to move now to my final part of my talk, and this is looking at extended family networks in Strahan. So earlier I noted that wedding presents may be thought of as touchstones of respectable middle-class family networks, established, expanded, and strengthened through marriage. Now this function of wedding presents was crucial as I embraced the napkin rings as a source, as evidence of frontier domesticity and respectability. And in fact, this encouraged me to look for evidence of the networks cemented through marriage that would have, I think, imposed social obligations on Tom that he may have found irksome. Now, the evidence of these networks cemented through marriage provides the starting point for this final section. And the evidence appears fleetingly in the first entry Mary made in her diary on the 20th of January. I think it's back. Yep, there it is, 20th January there. The 20th, Wednesday, had passed quietly. Tom worked at home in the shed and Mary occupied the children by taking them down to Gaffney's store for the mail. Mary and Tom also had time together while on errands to the post office after tea, where they had a chance meeting with Mrs. Hales. But she also noted that she saw Miss Mitchell, there we are. No, here we are. Saw Miss Mitchell about Gordon trip, wrote to Mr. Henry, saying, knowing that the Gordon referred to by Mary was the wide, forest-edged river that flowed into Macquarie Harbour and that Mr. Henry ran river excursions on his steamer, I surmised that Miss Mitchell was interested in sightseeing. I also presumed that the pair were acquainted well enough for Mary to go out of her way to ask a favour of this prominent Strahan merchant. And what I hoped was that they had a social connection that might yield information about Tom and Mary's social life in Strahan. Now, one of T-Mag's barometers, the one with the inscriptions on the back, helped to confirm Mary and Miss Mitchell's relationship. Family research revealed the latter's identity as Sarah Elizabeth Emma Mitchell, one of B.J. Mitchell's paternal aunts. His parents were Edwin Harry John Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell's brother, and Annie Margaret, Mary Moore's sister. So I'm not quite sure what the relationship between Sarah and Mary is. Might be sisters-in-law, but anyway, they are connected through marriage very clearly. Sorry, that's tiny writing. There are a lot of children to get onto that family tree. The Mitchells were a prominent family, long established on the east coast of Tasmania. Entries in the family's visitors' books confirm the connection between the Mitchells and the Sollys, with a visit by Benjamin Travis Solly occurring in 1874. Mary, his eldest daughter, stayed for several weeks in 1877, 78, and Annie, a few years younger, in 1878 and 1880. Annie subsequently, or consequently, married Edwin Mitchell in 1882. The couple and their growing family lived at Mayfield near Swansea, and they were in regular contact with Sarah and the widowed Mrs. Mitchell, who remained at the family home, Liz Dillon. Now, Sarah was a relentless chronicler of daily life. From her diaries, I learned that in 1892, she and her friend Harriet Mason embarked on a fortnight-long sketching and sightseeing tour of the West Coast. Of course, it was natural that Sarah would call upon her kin through marriage while the pair were in Strahan. Tom and Mary would be able to supply Sarah and Harriet with the security, sociability, and introductions required by unmarried ladies travelling in a wild region without a male companion. Now, the two friends checked into the hotel opposite the Moore's cottage after their steamer reached Strahan, and Mary was soon informed of the women's safe arrival. In Sarah's words, after dinner that day, they called on Mrs. Moore, née Mary Solly, and got a sketch. And the sketches of the Moore's cottage. Sarah's use of Mary's maiden name in the diary clearly identifies the two women's connection long before Jane Mary Solly became Mrs. Moore. Now, just as an aside, this entry also reveals how the women responded to the threats men posed to their personal safety while they were travelling. Harriet kept guard of Sarah while she was threatened by a man on the steamer. Now, Mary reciprocated by calling on the friends that evening, inviting them to socialise the next day. The visitors were entertained by the Moores several times while they were in Strahan, usually in the afternoon. Their calls kept the Moores abreast of the pair's plans of movements further afield, because they did do quite a bit of travelling. And the four dined together twice. One of these occasions, which Sarah calls 4 o'clock tea, followed a walk to the Moores' block of land just out of town. The other, after a long day's sketching, involved Sarah and Harriet going over to tea and evening with Mr. and Mrs. Moore. Now, the material culture of dining has to be inferred from these entries. While not as formal as a dinner party, Mary would have attended to the niceties demanded of such an occasion, with Tom drawn into the social obligations arising from his wife's kin network and the general demands of genteel society. And we will just have to imagine how Mary set the table and the linen, china, and silver she used as trans-coastal family news was shared in the Moore's dining or drawing room. And such visits were part of a larger repertoire of intimate and pro forma performances that consolidated and articulated the social capital of respectable colonial families. The calls made by Sarah on her final morning in Strahan, some to people with whom she had a prior connection and others who had facilitated the friends' activities on the West Coast, further demonstrates her adherence to respectable sociability. These acquaintances included Katie Page, an old servant of her sister Amy, Police Superintendent Conlon, Ronald Giblin, a name some of you might recognise, who was connected to Sarah through marriage, and Mr. Henry, with whom Sarah and Harriet had taken the Gordon trip facilitated by Mary, referred to in that first diary entry that inspired 6 interesting sketches, including these 2 on screen. So I'm just going to wrap up now and conclude with a quote by literary biographer Hermione Lee from her 2005 collection of essays, Body Parts. It's a great collection. I thoroughly recommend it. Now, Lee writes that biography begins and ends not with whole life stories, but with relics, legends and fragments, with the parts and bits and gaps which are left over after the life has ended. That's what biographers use to piece together their stories, trying to make a solid figure embodied on the page out of what has gone on. So I've used relics legends and fragments too, so that Mary Moore is less of a shadowy, neglected wife of Tom. There's still a lot of work to do here, I realise, but she still is a person with her own story set within the respectable social networks of Strahan and beyond. The relics I've used are held in TMAG's social history collection. The legend, that of Tom and his reputation as an obsessive antisocial explorer of Tasmania's west, and the fragments, Mary's incomplete 1892 diary, and very selected parts of her sister-in-law's vast archive. Now, this approach has highlighted notions of gentility, augmenting Mary's presence and providing details of the social milieu that Tom rejected. My primary source has been a pair of engraved silver napkin rings, which have obliquely yet productively drawn out evidence of the material performance of respectability. As a wedding gift, the napkin rings were a tangible expression of status and middle-class networks. As table accessories, they signalled knowledge of genteel practices and performances. And as personal utensils, they were associated with the challenge of maintaining respectable levels of domestic cleanliness. In outlining these contexts and how the napkin rings have led me to other less obvious biographical sources, I hope that I have revealed the value of material culture for writing about women whose lives, like Mary's, have been overshadowed by accounts of their pioneering husbands. Yep. Yep.
And
Do you want me to get back to the? That's an interesting. I didn't have time to go into that. Yeah.
she's there, and it says father bigamist.
Because he was. Yeah. So her father mother were from New Zealand. Tasma was born in New Zealand. And
the name Tasma.
Yeah. It's quite interesting.
Yes.
I did this research a little while ago. I'm a little bit hazy on it. I think they're one of those families that move between Tasmania and New Zealand. But basically, I'm probably going to get this wrong. I think Mr. Bromley left a wife in Tasmania, went over to a place called Gisborne on the North Island in New Zealand. His Tasmanian wife came over to Auckland, but trying to look for him, but was very unsuccessful at getting him to go back to her. He'd kind of had this common law marriage, I think, with Tasma's mother, and they end up in Strahan because, of course, where are you going to go if you want to avoid any kind of interrogation of your past life? You go to as far away as you can. Interestingly, Tasma, I think, was Mary was interested in Tasma being a governess for the kids, or working with the kids, because I think Tasma becomes a teacher later on. Yeah, so they obviously managed to discard that disreputable kind of history. It comes up again when the first wife dies. Yeah, anyway.
The name Tasma was the pen name of a bit later era Tasmanian writer.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and so that's why I looked and thought, I wonder, is there any kind of connection there?
Yeah.
Can anybody else in the audience remember the Tasmanian Tasma's actual name?
Jessie Couvreur.
Say again?
Jessie Couvreur.
Yes,
Okay.
Jessie Couvreur.
Thank
Yes.
you.
I think that was her maiden name, and her married name was something else.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Beautiful.
Oh, interesting. Karen.
Thank you, Kirstie. That was very interesting, and it piqued my interest as well for another name, Sarah Mitchell, because I work with Kirstie at the museum as well. We have some material in the First Peoples collection that Sarah donated, a basket, maybe some rope made by Trigonini. And the fibres were sent down to Trigonini in Hobart. She made up this basket and rope and sent it back. And then Sarah must have sent it to the T-Mag with a big note about who made it, where it was from. So that's kind of really cool to see those whakapapa genealogy connections. Yeah, so thanks for that.
Oh, good. Yeah, yeah. And Sarah actually had her own museum.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Over on the East Coast. Yeah. I found a little newspaper report. Yeah.
And so do we have her diary and all those information?
We have the sketches, hundreds of them. And there's a great story about those. And special collections at University of Tasmania have the diaries and other sketches by her elder sister, Catherine, who died quite young. Yeah, so it's a incredibly rich resource source. And quite, I like the contrast between Mary's very, very concentrated accounting of her life and Sarah's just it's 80 years worth of everyday life.
Did she have children?
No.
There you go.
She looked after, yeah. No, yes. So she looked after Mrs. Mitchell until Mrs. Mitchell died in, I think, 1899. Then she goes on 2 fabulous overseas trips. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and her father, because that was the, she wrote that the material was for her dad, or the basket got sent back.
Yeah.
Was he a collector, or?
I don't know. I don't know so much about Mr. Mitchell.
But is he the Mitchell on that thing?
No, it's his son. Let's see.
So is Sarah's brother whose name?
Yeah. I hope I'm right.
We're no relation to the Mitchells who did all that surveying in New South Wales, the Mitchell Library Mitchells.
Don't know. But Mitchell was a surveyor and he was also a member of parliament. So, yeah, in Tassie, yeah.
I remember I missed it. How did you come by the Soviet rings?
They're in T-Mag's collections.
But how did they get?
Oh, they were donated by,
Oh, the granddaughter.
yeah, Barbara Alliston.
Yes, I missed
Yeah.
that bit.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh, wow. Oh, no.
My grandmother was Mary's younger sister, so there were 20 years between them.
Yeah.
My father was 20 years younger than his eldest.
Right.
So generations moved on.
Yeah.
I think the family had napkin rings of Benjamin Solly and his wife, but I don't have them. I think most of them are of the family.
Wow.
But they're not a solid silver. But
Right.
my recollection.
I don't think these ones are either.
Oh, I think. Oh,
I don't think so. Peter, do you know? My colleague Peter?
what's it? Silver.
Solid silver. They're not heavy. They're plate.
Oh,
Yeah, but I've actually been a little bit naughty and not talked to any descendants because I partly I just wanted to see where I could push this idea, this methodological idea. And so the kind of the napkin rings, I mean, I am pretty sure they were a wedding gift, but I wanted to use them as a kind of is metonym the word? Something like that. Anyway, to stand in for that idea.
I've actually seen them.
Yeah.
They didn't look very worn. Where, well, there was a bit. but
The initials.
the solid ones,
Yeah,
my recollection of that they were much more worn, so they probably polished a whole lot more because they would have been used in Hobart.
yeah. Yeah, I very much think that there we are, I will get. The initials are more polished, you know, and worn away. It's hard to see that there, but the rest of, but yeah, overall, they don't have a great deal of wear. And also I think it's, you know, it's obviously, I don't know what you do when you start to have children. Do you just stop using your yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, oh, well, thank you. That's,
napkin rings for our children. Still.
yes, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
They have them now.
Wonderful, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
like to get them from op shops.
Yeah,
And we've still got them originally from England, so we've always got that. The interesting you were talking about, May, was it ironing?
yes,
A 10-year-old, I can remember that was the first job we were given in our family, was ironing serviettes.
oh,
and,
okay, yeah,
and tea towels and
Yeah.
handkerchiefs, dad's handkerchiefs, because they were simple.
yeah,
Yes.
okay, oh, of course.
So that was-
Yeah, they weren't ironing blouses or kind of complicated things with pin tucks and so on. Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I that was how I learned to iron as well. Yeah, just the hankies and tea towels. Yeah, the flat things. Yeah. With any more questions, because we've gone a little bit over time now. Right, okay.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you everyone for coming along. And yeah, it was my pleasure to share that with you.